My name is Lou Wangberg, and I'm pleased to welcome you to one of my presentations on a variety of history and government-related subjects. We explore as many different variations, and we try to find out the story behind the story, to ask the question of why did this happen, and to look at the quirks and idiosyncrasies of the various personalities who have made history. Most of the time, we focus on US history, but once in a while, we will stray into variations that happen in the world. Anyway, I hope that you are able to enjoy this presentation that will be coming, and that you come and join with us frequently, as these will be appearing on YouTube as they are recorded from week to week. And with that, I welcome you to Lou Wangberg's presentations in the world of history and government. The topic today is the Cold War. And while some of you may not remember everything from the very beginning that we'll talk about, I'm sure that when we get into some of the discussion of things that occurred in the 50s and 60s, surely you will. This is such an enormous topic that I could conceivably do 3 sessions on this alone. I may not even get to 1960 today in terms of the slides and the coverage that I get to. My earliest remembrance of news dealt with big items from the Cold War. I probably in the late 40s remember some things, but surely in the early 50s, I remember very clearly some of the events that I'll be talking about as we move forward. The Cold War. And largely, it's a time we'll talk a good deal about US foreign policy in the Cold War. And we'll start with Truman, actually just a little bit before Truman, and then we'll go on up through Kennedy if we get so far today. Most of it today will start with 1945 to 50. The origins of the Cold War. It was a new term. We'd never heard this before. And so we will be taking a look at Yalta and the Potsdam conferences, the end of World War II, the creation of the United Nations, Iran, the first Cold War crisis, Turkey, Greece, and the Truman Doctrine. It showed Truman in his true colors, this man who came from Missouri and nobody thought he could handle it, and he did really handle it quite well. We'll talk about the creative and very powerful and important Marshall Plan, the fate of Czechoslovakia, the Berlin blockade, the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the communists taking control of China in 1949, and the Soviet Union emerging also and becoming a nuclear power. I'm going to back up just a little bit before we to the Tehran conference, November 28th to December 1st, 1943. This was in Iran. It was a strategy meeting of Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. It was held in the Soviet Union's embassy in Tehran, Iran, or what we used to once upon a time call Persia. Why was it there? It was there because Stalin refused to travel very far. And so it was a concession to him that they met in Iran. It was the first World War II conferences of the big 3, Soviet Union, United States, and the United Kingdom. The main outcome was the Western Allies' commitment to open a second front against the Nazi Germany, because the Soviet Union was suffering terribly. They suffered much more during World War II than any other single nation. The conference also addressed the big 3 allies' relations with Turkey, Iran, operations in Yugoslavia, and against Japan, and what was going to happen at the end of the war. A separate protocol pledged that they were going to recognize Iran's independence. And here they are. Joseph Stalin on the left, Franklin Roosevelt in the center, and Winston Churchill on the right. I had to throw in this picture. This is 1943 3. Now notice what's going to happen to him by the time we get to Yalta. Yalta, which we're going to mention in a moment, occurs just 2 or 3 months before Roosevelt is going to die. This is a picture from Yalta. A Yalta Conference, that's February 1945, and they met to discuss the future of Europe after the war. Now, where is Yalta? Yalta is that peninsula, it's almost an island sticking out into the Black Sea. Today, it is now again attached to Russia. It was originally part of the Ukraine, and then Russia grabbed it, took it away again a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, I guess it's getting to be. Yalta is often the warm port for the Soviet Union or for Russia. Sort of a resort location. And they addressed the following issues. What was the world going to be organized like at the end of World War II? And this is one of those major disruptive events. Probably, if you argue in history, there's no other single event in history that was as disruptive as World War II. So it was changing everything around. What was the world going to look like? And then a declaration on what was liberated Europe going to look like. Obviously, they had to do something about Germany after they conquered it, and by February of 1945, it was only a matter of months before they were going to finish that job. So how were they going to divide it up? A zone of occupation for the French, who had really few soldiers in the war. Reparations, Poland, which had been disappeared from the map and reappeared, and finally, the question of Yugoslavia, the Union of the Slavs, and an agreement regarding the entry of the Soviet Union to the war against Japan. Now, the Soviet Union was the ally of the United States and of the United Kingdom, but they had not entered the war against Japan, and we needed them to do that. And so it happened then that Roosevelt dies. April 12th, 1945, and Truman is now shoved into the presidency, and there are urgent matters to discuss. And so they go to a suburb of Berlin called Potsdam in July of 1945. And this is when they're going to decide how to deal with Germany and Japan. Interestingly, while Churchill was there, he received news that he had been defeated, or his party had been defeated in the parliamentary elections, and so he's going to be out of power momentarily as well. So what were the issues at Potsdam? And there are too many of me to actually run through the listing of, or to say all of them, so I'm just going to go down the list, and you can see the different things. Reparations from Germany. Were they going to pay like they did after World War I? What was going to happen with the German Navy and their merchant marine? War criminals. What was going to happen with Austria, Poland? Conclusion on peace treaties, admissions to the United Nations organization. And then there were all these territories out in the oceans and around Africa and so forth. What was going to happen in terms of trusteeship? And revised the Allied control procedures in Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Lots of issues. And there were more. Orderly transfer of the German populations, oil, Black Sea straits, waterways, transport, directives to military commanders on Allied Control Council, use of Allied property for salad. This was a big deal. How were they going to resolve all of these things? And they had to do it very quickly. And so all of these were issues that they were trying to address in a matter of 3 or 4 days at Potsdam. So what's missing? What was not officially mentioned? What was not covered at Potsdam? The atomic bomb. We had it. We didn't officially tell the Soviet Union about it, though they probably had their espionage revealing to them that something was happening. And we're going to drop that bomb very shortly in August. The United Nations meets for the first time in 1945. And this is a big deal. About 60 nations. Today, there are over 190 nations in the world. At that time, there were only about 60. Iran was the site of the first disputes in the Cold War in 1945-46. British and Soviet troops had jointly occupied Iran since 1941, and the reason was, of course, good old oil, to protect oil reserves from falling into German hands. And that, in fact, was one of the main reasons why Hitler had launched his attack on the Soviet Union. He wanted to get to all of this oil that was down in the Caspian Sea area. The Soviets refused to withdraw their forces, and the case was one of the first things that came up before the newly formed Security Council in March of 1946, when the Soviet ambassador Andrei Gromyko had a hissy fit and he failed to get a postponement of the debate. The Soviets walked out, and the Security Council proceeds to move ahead anyway. It stood its ground. 6 weeks later, Stalin folded and withdrew his troops from Iran. Greece and Turkey. Both Greece and Turkey faced communist revolts in 1947 and asked the US for aid to defend themselves from communist takeovers. Fighting against the communists in Greece is pictured down here. It was a bloody affair. And we were trying to preserve Greece and Turkey from becoming even more communist nations in the sphere of Soviet influence. And so it is Truman who does the right thing. Now, Truman was poorly rated as a president when he left office in 1953, probably down in the low 20s in terms of popularity. And yet what historians have now said as they look back on what Truman did in terms of desegregating the armed forces, deciding on terms of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bomb use, the Marshall Plan, many, many other things that he did. But he is credited with saving Greece and Turkey. He said that seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. And the free countries look to us for support, and if we falter, we may endanger the peace of the world again. Our great responsibilities have been placed on us by the swift movement of events. For the first time, perhaps a little bit before this, after World War I, but certainly after World War II, we are the preeminent world power. President Truman asked Congress for $400 million in aid plus for US troops and advisors for both Greece and Turkey. We are not going to let them become communist without a fight. And we are going to fight back. And we're going to do this in Italy and other nations later as well. Now we have this famous man, George F. Kennan. George F. Kennan had a huge influence on US history because he comes up with a policy called containment. Containment. It's clear the United States cannot expect in the foreseeable future to enjoy political intimacy with the Soviet regime. He knew we weren't going to get along with these Russians. It must continue to regard the Soviet Union as a rival, not a partner in the political arena. We must continue to expect that Soviet policies will reflect no abstract love of peace and stability, no real faith in the possibility of a permanent happy coexistence of the Soviet socialist and capitalist world, but rather a cautious, persistent pressure towards the disruption and weakening of all rival influences. Long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This idea of containment that comes out of the brain of George F. Kennan becomes our policy in America for the next 3 decades. Truman, who was not short on saying what he believed, he said, "I'm sick of babying the Soviets." President Truman wrote this on January 5th to the Secretary of State. He was upset the USSR was taking over Eastern European nations and imposing communist governments. Famously, Winston Churchill goes and gives his Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946 at Fulton, Missouri. And you say, well, why the hell would he go to Fulton, Missouri, to a small college and deliver this address? Well, if you think about it, where is Harry Truman from? He is from Missouri. And so it's logical that he would go there. Churchill's main points were that there should be a US-UK agreement within the framework of the UN to resist and deter any disturbances to world peace, and that Stalin wants not war, but the fruits of war. And if the Allies stay strong and united, they can counter any Soviet threat. And he was prescient in saying that because it was true. A shadow has fallen upon scenes so lately lighted by Allied victories, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Here he is in his own words.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all our subjects, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. An attempt is being made by the Russians in Berlin to build up a quasi-communist party in their zone of occupied Germany by showing special favor to groups of left-wing German leaders. At the end of the fighting last June, the American and British armies withdrew westward in accordance with an earlier agreement to a depth of some point of 150 miles upon a front of nearly 400 miles, in order to allow our Russian allies to occupy this vast expanse of territory which the Western democracies had conquered. If now the Soviet government tries by separate action to build up a pro-communist Germany in their area, this will cause new serious difficulties in the American and British zones, and will give the defeated Germans the power of putting themselves up to auction between the Soviets and the Western democracies. Whatever conclusions may be drawn from these facts they are, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace. On the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, I repulse the idea that a new war is inevitable, still more that it is imminent. It is because I am sure that our fortunes are still in our hands, in our own hands, and that we hold the power to save the future, that I feel the duty to speak out now, that I have the occasion and the opportunity to do so.
One of the greatest men of the 20th century, without a doubt, and one who could see the future more clearly than most of the leaders of his time. So here's what Europe then finally looked like in 1948. You'll notice the Soviet Union still has many of its Soviet socialist republics as part of it. The Ukraine, for example, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. But eventually that would break up and become a number of nations. Czechoslovakia will eventually become 2 nations. And we will eventually see the reunification of Germany. But at this time, that is what Europe looked like in 1948. These are the nations of Europe that became communist. You had Yugoslavia was communist, but it was not under the sphere of the Soviet Union. It was its own version of communism. But all of the rest of these were under the thumb, if you would, of Stalin. And here are the great number of surplus US military vehicles in Germany in 1946. The soldiers who had fought in them were back in the United States. So we had all this surplus equipment we basically just left in Europe or disposed of it in some way. And we manufactured one heck of a lot of stuff during World War II. We became the arsenal of democracy, as the term had been used. And when famously, US Secretary of State George C. Marshall at Harvard in 1947, where he delivers his historic speech announcing the Marshall Plan for the economic recovery of Europe. We were not going to do the same thing that had happened after World War I. We were not going to let Europe languish into economic poverty. And this was a very, very wise decision on the part of the United States. This is part of his speech. And he said the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Remember, we hadn't had bombs dropping on the United States. It is our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. This is an excerpt from his talk.
Page from Sunday morning, Almanac, June 5th, 1947. Today, the United States offered help to Europe struggle to recover from World War II. That was the Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced the economic assistance plan that bears his name during the speech at Harvard.
He is right that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace.
Western Europe quickly embraced the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union and its eastern satellites rejected it. Congress approved the plan in early 1948.
This act is a momentous occasion in the world quest for enduring peace.
For the next 4 years, America provided some $13 billion in economic aid, equivalent to more than 100 billion. The Western European nations quickly revived, went on to form what eventually became the European Union. By contrast, the Eastern European countries stagnated. Ultimately, to the Soviet bloc's collapse beginning in 1989.
Yeah, George C. Marshall really stayed at home. He did not direct troops actively in the field, but it could be said that he was the architect of much of the military success that we enjoyed during World War II. There's a cartoon from the time that's showing what was going to happen if the Marshall Plan is delayed. Western Europe would become vulnerable to the Soviet bear. How Europe was to be reconstructed under the Marshall Plan. We were going to modernize their industrial equipment, create sound currencies and national budgets. And by the way, their equipment became better than ours because it was new. Expansion of trade, increase in exports, economic cooperation among the countries, removal of restrictions in foreign trade, increase in production, especially in agriculture and energy, improvement in transportation systems. The Europe that you see today can largely be attributed to George C. Marshall's Marshall Plan. And here's the first ship carrying aid. It arrived in May of 1948. Here are some of the architects. Hoffman, the one who's in the center, well, I'll have to say who they are, first of all. Truman, of course, George C. Marshall, Paul Hoffman, who would direct the entire program, and Averell Harriman, who was at that time very high in the State Department. And here's a picture that shows Stuttgart, Germany, before and after, in 1947 and 1955. It was told all of these devastated cities that we have bombed to pieces were rebuilt. Here's another example. This is the city of Hamburg in 1947 before the Marshall Plan, and then afterwards, same street, same vantage point for the picture in 1952. So with help from the Marshall Plan, Western European countries revived and revived magnificently. It's a major factor in Western Europe's recovery from the devastation of World War II. Now, I'm not going to go through any of these numbers except to note that in terms of total you'll see that the countries that benefited the most were France, the German Federal Republic, or West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom especially. Again, Europe in 1948, and there's Czechoslovakia. In 1948, the Communist Party seized control of what had been, briefly at least, a democratic nation of Czechoslovakia, and made it too a USSR puppet state. After the war, Berlin, the capital city of Germany, was divided into 4 zones: the USSR, French, British, and American. The 3 Allied united their zones into what became known as West Berlin. But it was deep inside the communist-controlled part of Germany. And there you see one called the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic. It was neither a democratic nor a republic, but that's the term that they use. 2 German nations became into existence in 1949, one a puppet of the Soviet Union, the one free. June 23rd, the USSR of 1948, the USSR imposed a complete blockade on railway, road, and canal traffic leading to West Berlin from the Allied German zone. No supplies of any type, including food, fuel, and consumer goods were allowed into West Berlin. Stalin wanted to starve the city into submission because he wanted to control all of Berlin, and he was not happy that there's a separate West Germany and its own currency and so forth. This is a cartoon that shows Joseph Stalin, who's saying to Harry Truman, "Whose move?" It's a chess game that we're playing. What will President Truman do about Berlin? He had to react to this. And he could have just simply folded over and let Stalin have his way, but he declined to do so. So they came up with an operation called Vittles. And we're going to hold on to West Berlin. He shows an airlift from the operations presented to him, used for keeping the city supplied.
The Berlin airlift, the biggest airlift in history. Dateline, Germany, 1948. Hoping to drive his Western adversaries out of Berlin, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin orders his troops to cut off all access to the city. Blocked by land and sea, the Allies respond from the sky with the most massive airlift in history. On June 26, 1948, a fleet of U.S. Air Force C-47s carries 80 tons of food into Berlin. This landmark airlift is but the first of what will become a mammoth mission of mercy.
They airlifted cargo to keep the population alive, to give the population sources, energy. 2/3 of all the cargo that was part of it was coal, because the Soviets had shut off the electricity supply to the western parts of the city. Obviously, during the winter, this is a particular problem.
The operation is soon joined by the U.S. Navy and the British Royal Air Force. With these added reinforcements, Operation Vittles kicks into high gear. On Easter Sunday, April 16, 1949, the Allies organized the Easter Parade, an airlift that will be the dramatic climax of Operation Vittles. Over a frenetic 24-hour period, American and British planes touch down and lift off every 30 seconds. The Allies deliver an astounding 12,940 tons of cargo, including enough coal to fill 1,100 rail cars.
Scale was completely unprecedented in the history of military operations.
The Easter airlift is a crushing blow to the Soviet blockade, rendering the operation futile. In the face of Western resolve, the Soviet Union officially ends the blockade on May 12, 1949. The final tally of the airlift is astonishing. Operation Vittles lasted an incredible 15 months, from June 1948 to September of 1949. By the end, American and British pilots had flown 92 million miles on 277,000 flights, delivering nearly 2.3 million tons of supplies. Simply put, the biggest airlift in history.
Yes, it's an incredible accomplishment, beyond really our description that they were able to do this. And as you noted, coal was one of the important things they had to ship because that was the way people heated houses in those days. They didn't have the same kinds of other options that we do today. Little cartoon down below that's showing a kid getting the candy. And it happens that a bra is one of the parachutes that's being used. But anyway, they use parachutes to drop things in, also dropping candy down to the kids. And President Truman made it clear that if one cargo plane was shot down, it would mean war between the U.S. and the USSR. Harry Truman did not take any guff. When he laid down a red line, he meant it. As you might be able to tell from my comments, I have a great deal of admiration for Harry Truman. There were some planes that crashed, however, so that was unfortunate, but they were not a great number. Finally, the Russians give up. And here's some statistics on the total number of tons of the flights and so forth that took place. It's almost 278,000 flights. I mean, you think about that over 15 months. That's nearly non-stop of flights going one after the other after the other. So as if that wasn't enough trouble in the world, in October of 1947, the United Nations, this new organization, authorized the creation of the State of Israel, with both the US and the USSR voting in favor. May 14th, Israel declared its independence, and 5 Arab states immediately invaded with the goal of destroying the newly created Jewish state. They were defeated by Israel. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husani, stated, "I declare a holy war, my Muslim brothers. Murder the Jews, murder them all." He was always a little suspect because he did have relations with Adolf Hitler during World War II. Because of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, 500,000, 500,000 Arabs fled Israel, and many remain refugees today, hoping to return to their former homes. It's estimated as many as 800,000 Jews were forced to leave Arab countries. And most of these refugees were absorbed into Israel. It was a reconfiguring of populations of the world, and we're still fighting that war. Still going on, and we just have had a new incident in the last couple of months. Then in the other side of the world, August 15th, 1948, the Republic of South Korea, with its capital in Seoul, is founded. 1 month later, the Communist Korean People's Republic, Democratic Republic, is founded with its capital in Pyongyang. Now, it again is neither democratic nor a republic, but that's the nature of words, isn't it? Dean Acheson became the Secretary of State in 1949 under Harry Truman. When I was a kid, I always thought this man looked like a Secretary of State with his mustache and so forth. I don't know, he just always had that image in my mind. In that post, he developed a policy to contain communist expansion by funneling economic and military aid to the democratic nations, and he helped to establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Now, remember, George Washington said we should never enter into entangling foreign alliances. Well, we didn't. All through our U.S. history, we did not enter into a permanent alliance until we joined NATO in 1948. And 1949. The first Supreme Commander, of course, was General Dwight Eisenhower. He had been the man who had taken charge of D-Day in 44 rather, and he was very popular and very capable. In 1949, 10 West European countries and the United States and Canada signed this NATO organization, free and sovereign countries to collective security. The purpose is an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Now, NATO's functions have been expanded since that time, but that was the original purpose. Dean Acheson signs the treaty, first session of the North Atlantic Treaty Council. Here are the countries that originally belonged: Iceland, Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, Luxembourg, Portugal, France, Italy, and Belgium, and the United States and Canada. Later joined by Greece, Spain, Turkey, and West Germany. And so here we see the 1949 to 1962 members of NATO. And there are three different kinds of categories. As you'll see, those are in the deep blue were members of the European Union only. Those who belong to both NATO were in gold, and then those NATO only were in gold, and those who were both were the ones who are in purple. And then this shows the different times when different countries joined NATO over the years. The last to join would have been Slovenia, and I believe that's Albania among the last to join in 2009. And this is a picture of NATO today. Then more problems. Mao Zedong, October 1, 1949, the communists won the Chinese Civil War and the People's Republic of China is established with the USSR as its ally. In the US, the phrase losing China became a political issue. Along with the idea of containment, we weren't going to ever let that happen again. We were never going to have another China be lost to a communist nation. Chiang Kai-Shek, the leader of nationalist China, was forced to flee to the island of Taiwan to escape the communists. And this is studying Chinese history is fascinating because it's a very complicated thing. Chiang Kai-Shek was never really the full leader of China. He was fighting with various warlords in different sections of the country, and one of those warlords happened to be Mao Zedong, who ultimately, with his communists, is able to prevail, and Chiang Kai-Shek retreats to Taiwan, and they are still a separate entity. Though we found out from recent history, you better not call them a country, though they really are a country. In February 1950, two great communist powers signed the Sino-Soviet Pact, creating a bilateral defense commitment and settled boundary issues. The USSR also agreed to provide limited aid to China. In 1980, I went to China. I was among the first Westerners to go in on a diplomatic trip. And it was quite primitive. You could stand on the street and you could wait 6, 7, 10 minutes before a car would go by. Very undeveloped, very dirty, very third world kind of a country. The hotel we were staying in was really quite primitive and quite old and quite, I would call it decrepit. And so I kept asking my interpreter, I said, when was this hotel built? Because I wanted to be able to go back to the United States and say that I stayed in a hotel that was called something or other before the liberation in 1949. And he kept saying back through the interpretation, no, it's a new hotel. It's a new hotel. Well, I looked at the plumbing fixtures and I looked at the woodwork and so forth, and I thought, and the tattered carpet and whatnot, this surely can't be a new hotel. Well, finally, I was able to get enough answer to determine the reason that it looked that way. It had been built by the Soviet Union as a gift in about 1955, and it just was so shoddily built. But that's one of the benefits of the exchange between the two nations at that time. So in 1949, they caught up with us. The Soviets exploded an atomic bomb and thus become the second nuclear power. So the Cold War timeline, August 26 to 45, the United States announces its intention to occupy Japan, held Korea south of the 38th parallel. Soviet Union occupied the north. September 2nd, In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's troops seize power in Hanoi and proclaim an independent Vietnam. The French want to return to their colony, however, by that same month. Also in November, Hungarian elections in which the Communist Party wins only 17% of the vote, but Stalin doesn't pay any attention to that. He moves to eradicate the opposition, consolidating that as a Soviet sphere influence. Yugoslavia becomes a federated republic under Marshal Tito, Josip Broz Tito, and then America and Great Britain withdraw their troops from Iran. The Soviet Union does not. 1946, Russia policy. Secretary of State Burns introduces a new get tough with policy, tough with Russia policy. In March, the Iron Curtain speech, Westminster College in Missouri. Poland, a national referendum approves the communist reforms. In Vietnam, Viet Minh forces clash with the French forces in the beginning of what will be an 8-year French Indochina War, and that will lead us eventually to become involved when we get into the 1960s. 1947, the Truman Doctrine. When we talk about that 400 million goes to Greece and Turkey, Hungary is taken over by the communist government. And then in June, the Marshall Plan that we've already talked about and the importance of that and what a difference it's going to make in the long-term future of Europe. More in 1947, the containment policy of George Kennan in foreign affairs. And to block peacefully the expansion of Soviet political and economic influence into vulnerable areas around the world. That's what will lead us into Vietnam, that containment policy, and why we believe that you cannot ever do another losing of China. National Security Act, the Department of Defense comes into being. And we come up with several new agencies in there as it's reorganized. And then Israel, the creation of the State of Israel, 47. Romania's monarchy is replaced by a communist regime. 1948, Czechoslovakia has a communist coup. In Brussels, a treaty signed by Belgium, Britain, France, Holland, and Luxembourg, creating an Atlantic Regional Mutual Defense Treaty. April 1, the Berlin blockade. It's going to last for 321 days. Israel, in 1948, Israel declares independence, and we have the beginning of the first Arab-Israeli war. And this is very important. On July 26, Truman issues an executive order desegregating the armed forces, a very important civil rights step. August 3rd, Whittaker Chambers accuses Alger Hiss of having been a key member of the communist underground in Washington. Then the Republic of Korea is founded. The Korean People's Democratic Republic follows the next month. So that takes us then into the 1950s. What will we look at in the 50s? The development of the hydrogen bomb. Though the atomic bomb isn't bad enough, now we're going to have the hydrogen bomb. And we're going to have the Korean War and John Foster Dulles' massive retaliation policy and his brinksmanship that he talks about. French Indochina War ends at Dien Bien Phu with a communist victory. Geneva Agreements, the division of Vietnam. The Warsaw Pact is formed in response to NATO. There's a revolt in communist Hungary. The Suez conflict. And Sputnik goes into the atmosphere. And Cuba is taken over by Fidel Castro. So, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I was growing up, I knew that I was going to be part of an atomic war. It was only a matter of time before it occurred when we would be at war with the Soviet Union and it would be atomic bombs dropped all over the world and in our country. And so I lived with that fear as a kid. President Truman approved the development of the hydrogen bomb, a new type of nuclear weapon that's at least 100 times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945. The first US hydrogen bomb was exploded in November of '52. The USSR is only a year behind us in 1953.
zero-hour bikini for the explosion of America's first airborne hydrogen bomb. Radar weather stations indicate perfect conditions throughout the mid-Pacific proving ground, so the control ship gives the go-ahead. All over the area, skiffs are launched to measure radioactive fallout. Final briefing to the crew of the giant B-52, the aircraft chosen to carry out this delicate mission, dropping a hydrogen weapon from the air. Incidentally, the Russians claim to have done it already. Lights and radar reflectors define the target area, while the bomber at a height of 9 miles peels off for the drop to be made at 50,000 feet. The bomb itself will explode at 15,000. These pictures, the first to be released, were photographed from 50 miles away. Brighter than 500 suns, America's most highly developed thermonuclear weapon. A detonation equal in force to 10 million tons of TNT.
Yeah, terrible, terrible event, and it was beyond comprehension, the power, and these things could literally, in an atomic war, destroy the world. So the Korean War breaks out in June of 1950. It's going to last for 3 years, a little over 3 years. The UN sent troops to fight the North Korean forces, but the bulk of the soldiers came from the US. It was, again, this is a case where the Soviet Union could have vetoed the action being a UN action, but they were pouting, and so they were absent from the Security Council declaration and were not there when it was declared. So we have the North Korea and South Korea, and it roughly is divided along the 38th parallel, dividing North and South Korea. The communist North Koreans pushed the South Koreans and unprepared US Army all the way to Busan in the south, where they were, and the Busan is down here, it's the southernmost city of South Korea. Well, finally, they were stopped by US firepower, but by then they dominated most of Korea, and this was not acceptable. And so we appoint General Douglas MacArthur, who was to be an overall command of the United Nations forces. And he made a brilliant invasion at Incheon. It was up here, and I don't know that my cursor is working so it can be seen, but up here near Seoul. And this, then they rapidly move, and they are in danger of trapping all of the North Korean forces fighting near the Busan perimeter. They advanced rapidly, and pretty soon he's up to the border with China. He is MacArthur, you have to give him credit. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to keep on going. He wanted to go into China and finish the job and get rid of the communists in China as well. But the Chinese had other ideas. In October of 1950, the Chinese communist troops invaded North Korea and pushed the UN armies back south again of the 38th parallel. And so there we sit. The North Korea turned into a stalemate resembling World War I's trench warfare. And we've been there ever since, from 1953 till today. Former General Dwight Eisenhower was elected president in November of 1952 with a pledge to go to Korea and to end the war. This is John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State up until '59. He'd been a critic of Truman's doctrine of containment, arguing that it should be replaced by a policy of liberation. He practiced brinksmanship, which he defined as the ability to get to the verge without getting into the war as the necessary art. He was attacked for intensifying the Cold War and damaging relations with neutral as well as communist nations. Remember, once upon a time, there was a commentator. Dulles is the first Secretary of State who flew a lot to other nations to meet with other leaders. And so there was one commentator who used the phrase, John Foster Dulles on one of his recent visits to the United States, because he was sort of a non-stop flying as a diplomat to other countries around the world. I guess it was funny, but anyway. In March of 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and the Korean peace negotiations took a more positive turn. July 27, 53, after 3 years of fighting, the armistice was signed. Korea remained divided at the 38th parallel, and it's still divided today.
Operation Big Switch begins to have tangible results on the home front as a naval transport bearing 411 Korean prisoners of war docks at San Francisco amid scenes of emotion. Ashore is Sergeant Harry Bory of Philadelphia, who is greeted by Generals Lewis and Glasgow. The joy of reunion dominates the whole pier as fathers, mothers, and wives embrace men, some of whom had been given up for lost. For the returning soldiers, it is the end of a long, dark night of suffering and loneliness. For the scores of relatives, it is the end of a nightmare of waiting and uncertainty. It is the answer to their prayers. Our boy is home again.
And that war, there are still veterans around from the Korean War, but they're getting to be quite elderly. Most of them 90-ish or beyond. So then we have the French Indochina War. After World War II, Ho Chi Minh, leader of the communist Vietnamese, believed that the US would not allow France to return to its former colony. Well, we did, because the French said, you owe us something. Well, when the French soldiers returned to reassert their authority and reclaim their colony, a bitter 9-year war began that would eventually end in French defeat. What we failed to recognize is, yes, he was communist, but he was a nationalist more than he was a communist. He wanted an independent Vietnam. That divided Vietnam into two halves. One, the North became communist, the South was under US influence. July of 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed, dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel for 2 years until elections could be held to unify the nation. The North became communist, the South supported by the United States. And here we see their president, Ngo Dien Diem at Washington Airport. He was a weak leader, unfortunately, when South Vietnam needed a very strong leader. SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, was formed in 1954 as a defensive pact to defend the nations against communist attack. It was disbanded in 1975 after several members quit. It was intended to be a replica of NATO, just was never as viable an entity. The Warsaw Pact comes about during this period in 1955 also. This is the USSR's counter to NATO, a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance. It's Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Germany, Poland, Romania, USSR, and Czechoslovakia. Warsaw Pact members, this is all those that were under the thumb of Joseph Stalin. Nikita Khrushchev follows Stalin as a leader after there's some interim maneuvering on the part of some of the old leaders of the Soviet Communist Party. Anyway, Nikita Khrushchev emerges. He denounces the crimes of Stalin in a famous 56 speech set out to reform the USSR. It's very typical that when you get rid of your previous predecessor, you then discredit them. Although he advocated peaceful coexistence, there were several serious encounters between the two superpowers while he was in office. In 1956, at a UN speech, he famously, pounding his shoe on the rostrum, said, "We, the USSR, will bury you, the US." Hungary. October 56, the people of Hungary rose up against their USSR communist-imposed government. For a short time, it appeared they might succeed, but the Soviet tank armies invaded and crushed the revolt. A similar thing took place in Poland.
Hungarian Uprising, Budapest, 1956, the Cold War. After the Second World War, Hungary was absorbed as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. A communist government was established. Political opposition was purged, and Matyas Rákosi, who was a strong supporter of Stalin, was appointed leader. Imre Nagy would replace him in 1953 when Stalin died. Until 1955, because of his independent attitude. Rákosi would again seize power, but his Stalinist leadership style, such as his use of the secret police to brutally put down opponents, made him unpopular with Hungarians, as did the low living standards. In June 1956, in the spirit of de-Stalinization, Rákosi was forced by the Soviet Politburo to resign as general secretary. Khrushchev's policies of de-Stalinization also encouraged a sense of freedom among Hungarians to criticize the Soviet regime and improve relations with the West. A rise of protests by students and workers waving Hungarian flags with the communist emblem in the center cut out arose in Budapest, erupting into active fighting in October 1956. The rebels were successful in the first stages of the revolution against Soviet troops. They pulled down Stalin's statue and released political prisoners. András Hegedűs was forced to resign, and the popular Imre Nagy now became prime minister. Fighting ceased on the 28th of October as the Hungarians believed that Soviet troops had withdrawn entirely. The new Hungarian government under Nagy began to make reforms for free elections and an end of the secret police. In a radio address to the Hungarian people, Nagy declared that Hungary would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev was not happy with the idea of Hungary withdrawing, therefore making it neutral against the Soviet Union's enemies. On November 1st, 1956, Soviet troops invaded Hungary, re-entering Budapest on the 4th of November. Nagy had appealed to the United Nations to support the revolution, but Western powers did not intervene, a risk of starting a global confrontation with the USSR. The Hungarians could not continue fighting against the numerous Soviet troops and tanks, and street fighting ceased after 2 weeks. The new pro-Soviet government was set up under János Kadar, while Nagy was caught and later executed for treason in 1958.
Subscribe to our
Yes, if you wound up going against what they wanted to do in the Soviet Union, you paid the ultimate penalty. Well, then we have the Suez Canal. The national leader of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, one of the most important waterways in the entire world, after the US refused to fund the Aswan Dam project, which was a pet project of Nasser, taking it away from the Suez Canal Company. Britain and France feared he might close the vital canal entirely and decided on military actions which led to the Suez Crisis.
In 1956, in Egypt has just nationalized the Suez Canal. The canal had previously been owned by the Suez Canal Company, which was controlled mostly by France and Britain. The seizure was ordered by the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who wanted to use the proceeds from the tolls the canal generated for infrastructure projects in Egypt. So Egypt was a non-aligned country during the Cold War, and Nasser wished to maintain good relations with both the USA and the USSR. Nasser's only real aim was to maintain the independence of the Arab world and to prevent any imperial powers, old or new, from dominating it again. America was unhappy with Nasser's lack of hostility to the Soviet Union, and so, along with Britain, withdrew previously promised financial assistance to Egypt. As a result, Nasser declared his intention to nationalize the Suez Canal to make up for the lost cash. The French and British governments were furious and saw the nationalization as an attack on their influence in the region. So Israel, led by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, was also upset with the nationalization, since Nasser immediately banned all Israeli shipping from the canal. Soon after, the French, under Prime Minister Guy Millet, invited the British, led by Prime Minister Anthony Eden, and the Israelis to bring the situation under control. control. The plan was for Israel to capture the Sinai Peninsula, and that Britain and France would then capture the Suez Canal under the pretext of restoring order to the region. On October the 29th, Israeli forces invaded the peninsula. The next day, Britain and France delivered an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel. Both sides were ordered to withdraw 10 miles from the Suez Canal if they would intervene. One problem: Israel's troops were still 40 miles from the canal. This gave Britain and France's part of the plan away, and both were met with international condemnation, specifically from the Americans, who were furious that they hadn't been consulted by their allies. On November the 5th, British and French paratroopers were dropped into the area around the canal to secure it. So the Egyptian army wasn't really prepared to resist the well-armed and well-trained militaries of the three nations attacking them, and they were quickly overrun. However, the population of Egypt rallied around Nasser, and many civilians took to resisting the invaders either passively or even taking up arms themselves. The military side of the conflict was over quickly, with Israel, France, and the UK achieving their objectives. Politically, though, it was a nightmare for them. Most nations across the world sided with Egypt, and the USSR even threatened to use nuclear weapons against Britain and France. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the US president, was absolutely livid with the British and French, and even went so far as to threaten to kick them both out of NATO. Furthermore, Eisenhower threatened to sell off sterling bonds, which would have severely harmed the value of the pound, which in turn would have likely crashed the British economy. As a result,
now, the significance of this, if there's any great significance that endures, is it's really the beginning of the end of colonialism. Power in the world shifts away from Britain and France, and now it is the USSR and the United States that are the superpowers. But colonialism is on its way out at that point. 1957, a new word entered the vocabulary that ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear bomb carrying missiles with ranges of over 5,000 miles. Now, no place on Earth was safe from nuclear destruction. USSR was the first to successfully launch an ICBM, and then we were not far behind. We also, that little round thing down on the right, that is the first satellite. It is Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. And Americans were shocked that the Soviets were the first into space. In 1958, it was a debate topic when I was in high school, and I can still remember my opening little bit from that, which went like this. The world was startled by the news in 1957 that the Russians had launched the first Earth satellite. Now, this Russian success was rather harmful to America's reputation and world standing, but it was very beneficial to American education. End of beginning. Anyway, it was a time when we suddenly realized maybe we're not really first in everything anymore. It takes us until the following 2 or 3 months later, in January 1958, before we were able to put our own satellite in orbit, and it is this one, Explorer 1. Now, there isn't so much to this particular little video, except that you need to remember that to do this, they basically had no computers, at least as we know computers today. And so it was an incredible accomplishment that we were able to get a satellite into orbit. Today, there are approaching 3,000 satellites that are in orbit around the Earth. And that, along with space junk, mean that we have the potential for some kind of catastrophe to occur. But anyway, this was the first launching of our first Earth satellite, February 1, 1958. Well, anyway, you get the idea of that. And then we'll move on to this part, that the atmospheric nuclear bomb tests were poisoning the atmosphere. We were discovering that strontium-90 was appearing in milk because of this radioactivity was descending from the skies all the way around the world after all of these tests were happening. And the Soviet Union began to see that that was a problem for them as well. And so both the United States and Russia in 1958 suspended atmospheric testing. And I'll just show you a little bit of this. You may remember this. We were all taught this in school in the 1950s.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association. Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous, since it may be used to...
And so we were all taught this. We were, in fact, all bombed. So that's probably a good point for us to stop, because now we'll cover a little bit next time of what happens with Fidel Castro and so forth as we move on towards 1960. And this is a potent enough topic to warrant at least two presentations, so you can rest assured that the next one will also be dealing with the latter part of the Cold War and all that it influenced everything that's happening today. We have it lasting until 1989, when finally the Soviet Union, as we had known the Soviet Union, disintegrates, and that changes the world scene finally. We still have our problems. We have multiple problems, terrible problems in the world, but at least they are not quite the same